and squeeze tightly to get rid of as much water as possible. I then spread it out on some paper towel and let it dry for a couple days. When I came back, I had some nice and dry nylon with a mass of about 0.75 grams. It was a little bit tough, but still quite easy to break apart using my fingers. All of the nylon pieces were then shoved into a small test tube. I started blasting it with a heat gun, and the goal now is to completely melt it. The melting point of nylon is around 265 C, so this is going to take a lot of effort. It's also possible to use a Bunsen burner or a blowtorch, but I really didn't want to burn things. I occasionally had to stop and shove everything down to the bottom using a metal spatula. Once I got to the last little bit, I continued heating it until it completely liquefied. You'll notice here that there's some bubbling going on, and these are impurities that are boiling off. The major impurity is hexamethylene diamine, which boils around 205 C. The boiling eventually dies down a lot, and I decided that I was pretty much done. I allowed it to cool, and to get out the nylon, I smashed the test tube, which kind of exploded. I found the end piece that flew away, and this is the nylon that I got. Despite the fact that it was low quality and dirty, I was honestly impressed with it. The portion that was in contact with the test tube was very shiny and smooth, but the inside was a little bit bubbled up. After seeing what I made here, I decided that I would for sure make nylon the other way. The other way is a lot cleaner, and I should be able to get a much higher quality nylon out of it. A big thanks goes out to Audible for sponsoring this video and supporting my channel. Audible offers an unmatched array of content, including audiobooks, original audio shows, news, comedy, and much more.
What distinguishes Indian food is its magical use of spices. I always loved food, and what I perhaps didn't know is...
A few months ago, I made some nylon, and here's some footage from...
Голодный, что ли? Что, голодный? Играть надо игру. Вот это было самое. Нормально. Нет.
Мы искали его больше 6 лет и нашли легкий способ заговорить.
Agilent, a top.
A few months ago, I made some nylon, and here's some footage from the video. Although this is an interesting way to make it, it's not the most efficient method, and it's not how it's done industrially. The process that I showed was mostly for demonstration purposes, because it's quite wasteful in terms of solvents and other chemicals. In this video, I want to show you guys how it's done industrially, but keep in mind I don't have all the proper equipment, so it's not the cleanest process. Also, in particular, I'm making nylon 6,6, which is a specific type of nylon. There are other forms of nylon, like nylon 6, which are made in a different way, and I'll eventually cover this in some future videos. Okay, so to get started, in terms of chemicals, I really only need 3 things. I'll be needing some 95% ethanol to use as a solvent, some hexamethylene diamine, and adipic acid. The adipic acid was made in a previous video, and if you're interested in seeing how I did this, there's a link in the description. Compared to the other method, this is really bare bones. Just for comparison purposes, here's the list of chemicals that I used for the other one. Anyway, to get things started, I dump a bunch of adipic acid into a beaker, followed by some ethanol. I turn on the magnetic stirring and I wait for everything to dissolve, which for me took about 5 minutes. It looks like everything has dissolved at this point, but it's still a little bit cloudy, so I'm gonna have to filter it. I quickly set up a glass funnel, which is plugged with some cotton and topped with sea light. Before passing through my solution, I wet it with a little bit of ethanol, and then I dump out everything that passed through. Sea light is especially good at filtering out small particles, so the solution that I get through is crystal clear. All the white stuff on the sides is adipic acid, so using some ethanol, I wash the funnel a couple times to try to pass it all through. Okay, so with the adipic acid solution made, it's time to dissolve the hexamethylene diamine. The hexamethylene diamine is quite corrosive and stinky, and it also fumes like you see here. So to this I add some ethanol, and I turn on the magnetic stirring. Eventually, most of it dissolves, and I add a small amount of water to get rid of the rest. Okay, so this is how things are going to go down. I bring back my adipic acid ethanol solution, and above it I set up a separatory funnel. Then I dump the hexamethylene diamine solution into the funnel. I clean up the beaker with some ethanol, then I turn on the stirring, and I'm ready to get the reaction going. I open up the separatory funnel and I adjust the drip rate so it takes about 10 minutes for it all to be added. So in terms of what's going on here, adipic acid is, well, an acid, and hexamethylene diamine is a base, so when it's added, it undergoes an acid-base reaction. This produces the nylon 6,6 salt, which initially stays dissolved in the solution. I thought the salt was going to precipitate out about halfway through the addition, but even when I was done, it didn't seem like much was happening. I filmed it for about 5 minutes, and the whole time I was kind of confused as to why nothing was happening. The reaction produces some heat, and it's a little bit warm here, so I thought maybe that was keeping things dissolved. I went to get some plastic wrap just to cover the top so I could put it in the freezer, and of course when I turn my back for something like 30 seconds, that's when something actually happens. Anyway, I let it stir for about 5 more minutes, and then I put my plastic wrap to good use and I threw everything in the freezer. I'm not sure if this is actually necessary, but I figured that maybe it would help precipitate a little bit more of the salt. So a couple hours later, when it was nice and chilly, I vacuum filtered it off. I used some ice-cold ethanol to wash the salt a couple times, and then I left the vacuum on to try to dry things up. Even after leaving it for something like 20 minutes on the filter, it was still a little bit wet with ethanol, so I threw it in my vacuum desiccator. I left it for about a day or so, and when I took it out, it was nice and dry, but for some reason it had turned a little bit yellow. I'm not really sure why. Anyway, now that it's dry, I'm ready to heat it and convert it into the polymer. Everything's added to a small round-bottom flask, and then I set up a pretty weird apparatus. On the left, I have 2 hoses feeding into one, where the top one is a nitrogen feed, and the bottom one goes to my vacuum pump. The reaction produces water, so I set up a condenser and a receiving flask, and the opening on the right leads to a balloon. This reaction needs to be done at pretty high temperatures, and in the presence of air, both the salt and the polymer that forms can sometimes degrade. To avoid this, it's generally done under an inert atmosphere with something like nitrogen. Because there's air all mixed into the salt and throughout the apparatus, it's not quite as simple as just turning on the nitrogen. We first need to take all of the air out. So to do this, I make sure my nitrogen tank is closed, I turn on my pump, and I pull as good of a vacuum as I can. When the vacuum is pulled, you can see the balloon getting sucked in. When my pump gets to the max vacuum that it can pull, I close the valve and I open the nitrogen tank. When I do this, the balloon puffs up a little, and when I get to around this point, I close the tank. I then repeat this cycle 2 or 3 times, just to get out as much of the air as possible. After the final cycle, I leave the nitrogen on, and I take off the balloon. So at this point, the entire thing is filled with nitrogen, and I also have a constant flow of fresh nitrogen moving through it. Now I'm ready to get the reaction going, and I need to crank it up to about 220 degrees Celsius. It's kept at this temperature for about an hour, then it's raised to 270 C, and kept there for 3 hours. 270 C is the melting point of nylon 6,6, so when I heat it to this temperature, it should completely liquefy. Ideally, this would be done over a hot oil bath, but I didn't have any silicone oil, so I tried to get away with using a heating mantle. I thought that maybe it could be the same thing if I just hovered the flask in the middle, but it didn't really work. If I completely covered it, it probably would have worked a lot better, but I really wanted you guys to be able to see what was going on. So I decided to try a more direct heating method, and I swapped it for a smaller mantle. I insulated the back portion of the flask with some aluminum foil, and I hoped that maybe this would work. I cranked up the temperature, and it seemed to be working a lot better than the other one. A bunch of water is being produced, which tells me that the reaction is going on, and I also saw some melting occurring. So what I'm doing here is condensing the nylon salt into a polymer and producing water as a side product. For this reaction to occur, we need electrons from the nitrogen to attack the carbonyl of the adipate, but it really doesn't want to. The nitrogen doesn't have any electrons to attack with, and the adipate doesn't really want to take any. So to make this reaction work, we need to force it by heating it up. As far as I know, the exact mechanism isn't known, but I did find a paper that suggests what might be going on. Under the high heat, the salt reverts back to the starting materials, and the adipic acid then forms a dimer with itself. This dimerized structure is much more willing to take electrons, so it gets attacked by the hexamethylene diamine. A bunch of electrons move around, and it produces a compound with 2 hydroxide groups. The high temperature of the reaction then causes a water molecule to be kicked off, and it forms the final amide group. This new molecule has an open nitrogen on one end and a carboxylic acid on the other, so it can keep undergoing reactions and extending the chain length. Overall, this reaction process is very different from the one that I did in a previous video, but the idea is pretty similar. To make the reaction work, I first had to derivatize the adipic acid to make adipoyl chloride. So by doing this, it can be directly attacked by the amine, and it doesn't form this deactivated salt compound. It allowed me to do the reaction at room temperature, but as I said earlier, it produces a lot more waste.
Looking for smart solutions to save time? The new Agilent 58 and 5900 ICP OES instruments are designed for the user, with smart features like IntelliQuant that deliver deep insights into samples, processes, and operational status. IntelliQuant constantly examines your data to identify spectral interferences and makes recommendations to ensure you get the right answer every time, minimizing sample remeasurement and saving the troubleshooting time. The synchronous vertical dual view SVDV of the ICP OES 5900 takes a single measurement per sample, saving resources and increasing throughput. Reclaim your wasted time with new proactive approaches that bring greater confidence to your
Waste.